For the past 14 months, you have heard two main things about the war in Ukraine. The first is that the war in Ukraine is a war of national sovereignty. It is not a proxy battle between superpowers. Russia invaded Ukraine. That was immoral. The United States supports Ukraine because the United States supports democracy. But the United States itself is not at war with Russia. This is Ukraine's war to fight. The second thing we have heard over and over again is that Ukraine is winning that war. Ukrainian troops are brave and noble. Russian troops are evil and incompetent. The Ukrainians are beating the Russians. In the end, their victory is inevitable. Now, you're very familiar with these points because you have heard them every day since last February. You've heard them repeated by every power center in the United States, the Pentagon, the White House, the leaders of both parties in Congress, CEOs, and celebrities. And most insistently of all, you've heard them from virtually every single outlet along the entire spectrum of our national news media. These are the two essential themes of the war in Ukraine, and both of them are lies. We know that they're lies because late last week, leaked intelligence about the war in Ukraine began to appear on social media. Briefing slides prepared by the U.S. government began to show up, among other places, on Twitter. And the slides show that this is in fact not Ukraine's war. It's our war. The United States is a direct combatant in a war against Russia. As we speak, American soldiers are fighting Russian soldiers. So this is not a regional conflict in Eastern Europe. This is a hot war between the two primary nuclear superpowers on Earth. And yet this war has never been formally declared. It has not been authorized by Congress. And for that reason, this war is a violation of American law. It is a crime. The second thing we learned from these slides is that despite direct U.S. involvement, Ukraine is in fact losing the war. 7 Ukrainians are being killed for every Russian. Ukrainian air defenses have been utterly degraded. Ukraine is losing. The Biden administration is perfectly aware of this. They're panicked about it, but they have lied about this fact to the public.
There's been the problem on cable news, both Fox, CNN, MSNBC. You get a lot of people that are pro-war, and they're the Congress, members of Congress, senators, and so forth, and they're all giving these upbeat accounts of how well it's going for Ukraine. The documents give a far more realistic view, saying that basically it's going to come down to a stalemate. There is not going to be any big winners necessarily, and the Ukrainians are in a very bad position because they're not getting enough ammunition. The Russians have much more access to ammunition than the Ukrainians do. So there's a switch between the way America perceives the war, I think, to these documents, which give a more realistic, because it's done with intelligence, more realistic view of how the war is going.
There's some interesting findings in these documents that have been released. One, The Guardian points out, one slide suggested a small contingent of less than 100 special operations personnel from NATO members France, America, Britain, and Latvia were already active in Ukraine. Talk about the significance of that.
Well, that's what the Russians have been charging for a long time, that the U.S. is more heavily involved, or not just the U.S., but NATO and our NATO partner countries have been involved far more closely and far more directly with the war than is led to believe by the government, by the Biden administration. So it adds to the weight of those charges that the U.S. and its allies and the NATO partners are more heavily involved in this war. And that's a very dangerous situation, since you've got nuclear powers involved, Russia, the United States, France, and so forth, all nuclear powers, and we're all fighting over this one piece of territory, and it keeps getting more and more out of hand. So I think that's a very big danger.